The two most powerful words in the English language are I am, because whatever you put after those two words shapes your behavior.
I'm the boss. I'm in charge. Tell me what I need to do.
Trust is the boat, while inspiration is the wind. So if we don't have that boat, we're sinking. And so we have to work on building that boat of trust. Inspiration might come and go, but trust has to be present, ever present.
Welcome to Lessons Learned. My guest today is Rich Davini. Rich is a retired Navy SEAL officer whose career spanned more than 20 years and included more than 13 overseas deployments, 11 of which were to Iraq and Afghanistan. As the officer in charge of training for an elite Navy SEAL command, Rich spearheaded the creation of a directorate that fused physical, mental, and emotional disciplines. Since his retirement, Rich founded The Attributes Incorporated, where he's worked as a speaker, facilitator, and consultant, speaking to and training more than 5,000 businesses, athletic, and military leaders. Rich's new book, Masters of Uncertainty, looks at how we can use the techniques of elite special operators to turn stress and challenge into success. Rich, thanks so much for joining me today on Lessons Learned.
Hey, it's great to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Always good to see you. So I think a lot of people are familiar, I hope by now the audience is familiar with the attributes and kind of your early work, but you've written a new book called Masters of Uncertainty. Tell me a little bit about the book.
Yes, Masters of Uncertainty is really just a somewhat of a culmination of what I've been obsessed about for years, and that is, what is it that made spec operators and I guess specifically Navy SEALs do what they did. And for me, it was never about the skydiving or the scuba diving or the shooting. It was about the fact that we were and are individuals and teams that can drop into deep complexity and chaos and begin to perform. And so I always defined us as masters of uncertainty, but what I recognize is that these tools, techniques, these distinctions are in fact human. They're not just special operator centric. And so what I wanted to do was put it all together in a book to give everybody the chance to explore their own ability to become a master of uncertainty, both individually and as teams.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic for you to dig into because, at the most elite units, as you know, often what separates the most elite operators from those that are not as elite is their ability to handle this kind of confusing, complex, ever-changing, multifaceted environment and, make sense of it and then figure out, prioritize and figure out what's going on. So it's an interesting topic, I think, for you to pick up, especially in light of not only your career experience, but the time that you spent in trying to fuse these different, physical, emotional, mental components together.
Yeah, and I agree. And again, I think one of the things I realized and I recognize, as we all do, is that this is not it's not exclusive to spec operators, even at the most elite levels. But what these elite levels allow us to do, certainly allowed me to do, is see it in such detail and in such kind of visceralness that I began to say, okay, what's actually going on here? But again, every single one of us as human beings has stepped through uncertainty and challenge and stress in these ways. The key is, can we articulate it? And therefore, once articulated, can we practice it and repeat it and become very good at it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you looked at elite athletes, I'm probably, if you were to measure Tom Brady versus other quarterbacks, probably one of the things that makes Tom Brady is his ability to look at an evolving field and take a quick shot of that and quickly figure out what to do. I just think in elite special operations units, the stakes are so high and so obvious.
Yeah, they are. I would just say athletics. While I agree with the athletics analogy, I don't think it's the best environment inside of which to see this, because although athletics have inside of them some level of uncertainty, athletics for the most part are fairly certain environments. However, depending on the sport, the uncertainty level rises. So you take, for example, I think any fighting sport, the uncertainty level in that endeavor rises because you just don't know. Even though you can have a plan of what the opponent's going to do, you don't know. You're constantly reacting and adapting to what the opponent's doing. I think sports like climbing or in some cases, some of that extreme stuff where the environment creates a level of uncertainty. And so yes, applicable in all domains, more applicable in certain domains. Certainly special operations, your plan is to walk into an environment where you don't know what's going to happen. You hope you know what's going to happen. You plan for certain things, but ultimately you don't know. And if you can't react properly, in that case, the uh, the the consequence could be injury or death, and that's a serious situation. So
Yeah, for sure. So let's kind of walk through this a little bit because I want to kind of understand how do we respond to uncertainty? Like what is it that we're doing when we're faced with an uncertain situation, and what are the keys to us, understanding it and reacting to it?
yeah, the it comes down to our neurology, really, and uncertainty shows up in our system, or it's presented to us when three neurological factors are not present, or I'd say one of any one of the three, but three at the extreme. So those three factors are duration, i.e., how long this is going to last. Pathway, what's the route in or out, and then outcome, what's going to happen at the end. Now, when we are in an environment, our brains are trying to suss this out, and if we are in absence of one or more of those, uncertainty begins to rise. If we're in absence of all of those, we have deep uncertainty in our system, and that's when we really begin to get anxious and our autonomic arousal goes up. And so the idea is, how do we as human beings take control of that neurological aspect in terms of wanting to understand or know the duration, the pathway, and outcome, if in fact it's not immediately present to us?
So duration meaning how long the event is going to, how long this is going to happen for. Pathway, where I'm going, what my route is.
Yeah, what the route is, either out of it or through it, right? How do I get through this, and then outcome once I'm through. What's waiting for me at the end? So for example, if we get sick, if we have a sickness or an illness, we may not know exactly how long it's going to last. So we're absent duration. We do have a route. Maybe we have antibiotics or something. So we have a pathway, and we have an outcome because the antibiotics will eventually cure us. So we're in absence of only one, duration. So our stress or our level of uncertainty is mild. If we have an illness where we have it and there's no published remedy for it. But we've heard that people get over it. Okay, it's not. In other words, it's not fatal. Then we are in absence of duration, pathway, but we know the outcome. So now our levels of uncertainty are higher. If we have an illness that no one's really ever heard of, there's no known cure or remedy for it, and there's no real examples of people getting through it. Now we're in absence of all three: duration, pathway, and outcome, and our anxiety level really spikes because we're thrown into deep uncertainty. And so this is the idea. Our brain's trying to figure this stuff out, and one of the things we have to do to start moving through these environments is to, in fact, look to create our own duration, pathway, outcome.
It's interesting because as you're saying that, I'm thinking of the COVID epidemic, right at the beginning, where we don't know how long it's going to be, we don't know how many people it's going to kill, and there's no way to treat it. Our national anxiety is through the roof, and then it's like, okay, well, now there's a vaccine, and not that many people are dying, and you could, you still couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but you could kind of watch the anxiety nationally attenuate as those three things became more clear to the point that eventually everybody's like, oh yeah, no, we're fine, don't worry about it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and that's actually a great example because that's an example of a community, global community, going through that whole thing together. And of course, some nations were a little bit slower on the realization of any one of those things than others. But you're absolutely right. We were all in absence when we went into lockdown. All of us were in absence of all three of those. So as a planet, we were thrust into this environment where we all had deep uncertainty.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So okay, so those are the underlying factors that we're dealing with. We're trying to manage those three factors, right? What when we respond to those three factors, what underlies our personal response? Like what would make somebody very good at that versus they're not so good at it?
Yeah. So this therein lies the secret, and the secret, in fact, is you create your own duration, pathway, outcome, and you do this through a process that I call moving horizons. And what I mean by moving horizons is you pick something that you know you can control or foresee, and you focus on that. And what that does is that automatically creates a duration pathway outcome. Now, I'll just give an example. So many of your audience are aware of SEAL training and BUDS, basic underwater demolition SEAL training, where the guys we all go to become Navy SEALs, 6 months long, 90% attrition rate. I remember my BUDS class. I mean, you spend hundreds of hours running around with big, heavy boats in your head. And I remember specifically a time during Hell Week, it was the middle of the night or whatever. We're running on the beach with the boat on our head, and I'm miserable. We're all miserable. And next to me is a sand berm. And what I did at that moment, I didn't know what I was doing. Was I said to myself, you know what? I'm just going to focus on getting to the end of this sand berm. And so in the moment of kind of uncertainty, don't know how long this is going to last, don't know what's waiting for me at the end, and don't know how to get out of it. I created by picking horizon, I created a DPO, a duration pathway outcome. Duration from now until the end of the berm, pathway from here to end of berm, and outcome end of berm. Now, as soon as I did that, I cemented certainty neurologically in my brain. And once I hit that goal, once I got to the end of the berm, I in fact created a dopamine reward in my system, because we get rewarded with dopamine when we accomplish goals like that, which allowed me then to pull back out and ask the question again. And so what I recognized about SEAL training, and it really just being a spec operator in general, but SEAL training specifically, is it is one big exercise in really refining your ability to shift horizons, to move horizons and create DPOs. And those horizons have to be subjective to the environment and subjective to the intensity of the environment. So in other words, depending on the intensity of the environment, that horizon may be very short. I remember being in the waves in the surf zone freezing in SEAL training, and I remember saying to myself, I'm just going to count 5 waves. That was my horizon. I remember being at certain points in SEAL training and saying to myself, I'm just going to get to the next meal. That was my horizon. Or, in the case of boats, I'll get to the end of the berm. And so that horizon has to shift depending on the intensity of the environment, and it has to be created by the individual in a way that manages the dopamine response effectively. In other words, if you create a horizon that's too far, you're going to run out of dopamine. You're likely quit before you get to the end. If you create a horizon that's too short, you're not going to get that dopamine reward. And so any of you, and I know you're someone who's done Ironmans and triathlons and things like that, and anybody who runs marathons or stuff will know this intuitively. There are certain wickets we pick through those events, that we decide upon that are our horizons, and it's different for everybody. In other words, if you and I ran a triathlon together, you may pick a specific horizon that's like, if we're running the marathon portion, you may say, how many, 10 miles is my first horizon. Well, I might be like, well, 10 miles is too far for me. 2 miles is my horizon. So the horizons have to be internal, they have to be individualized, and they have to be specific and appropriate to the intensity of the environment.
It also strikes me that those horizons are going to move based on your emotional state, physical state, and everything else. Like if you ask me when I start the marathon, my horizon is the finish line. At about 14 or 15 miles, my horizon is the next lamp post, right? I'm going to run to that lamp post and then I'm going to quit. I'm going to run to that lamp post and then I'm going to
But
quit.
what I'll say, what you've just done there, John, is you've actually modulated you've modulated or refined your horizon based on the fact that you weren't getting rewarded. If you start that and your horizon is the finish line, you've just decided that you don't get rewarded until the finish line. And so what you've done in the moment as you're going through is say, oh, wait a second, finish line is too far. I'm going to start rewarding myself sooner than that. And what we can do, all of us as humans, we can do this in any environment. We can create these small horizons or big horizons, but create this reward system that allows us to step through challenge and uncertainty. And what happens in an uncertain environment, as you move through these horizons, you will move your position, which means you will either gain optics on what's going on. In other words, you will start to build a certainty around you. You'll start to understand your environment better, or you'll move through the environment and you'll be able to say, okay, I'm through now, and I can look back and figure out what just happened. But in either case, it is the way that you literally step through this stuff.
Well, and it is, I guess, to some degree, what would explain why, in a high attrition environment like BUDS, some people seem to be able to just persevere no matter what happens to them. While, the guy that's like, I'm going to get to the end of BUDS and that's the target and it's 6 months out when he's cold and sandy and miserable is like, it's just too far.
It's too far. And honestly, Hell Week, which is again for your listeners, or most of them know, but Hell Week, you start on a Sunday night in SEAL training. You start on a Sunday night and you go until the following Friday, right? And during that entire week, you only sleep for a couple hours. It's like 2 or 3 hours of sleep for the entire week. So you're cold, wet, and sandy for the entire week and just doing crazy stuff. And the saying when you go into Hell Week is that if you think about Friday on Monday, you're going to quit, right? And this is the horizons moving explained to a T. Because if on Monday I'm thinking about Friday, that's way too far. On Monday I'm thinking about maybe the next evolution, or maybe getting out of the surf zone, or in some cases 10 waves. Some people can even do this and say, just say, hey, the only thing I know and can control right now is my breath, so I'm just going to focus on taking 10 breaths. That is still creating a horizon. What you're doing is you're engaging your frontal lobe, and you're consciously starting to step through the environment you're in.
It's interesting. So if I'm, obviously there's some things that are separating those two people, and one obviously has a better ability to manage kind of their own dopamine in the moving horizons, but it also strikes me that there are kind of things that are underlying who you are as an individual that's going to read that. I'm thinking back to, like, your first book, The Attributes, and it strikes me that there's probably some innate attributes here in play as to who is able to manage those horizons versus not able to manage those horizons.
Well, you're absolutely right, and quite specifically, the one attribute that I think relates to horizon shifting or moving horizons directly is compartmentalization, the ability to focus on something, block out everything else, and move to completion on that. However, our performance, our behavior in uncertainty, challenge, and stress, which is really us at our most raw, by the way, because when this starts to happen, it becomes us at our most raw, and us at our most raw is like personality goes out the window. It's just like, who are we at our most raw? And so to understand how we behave at our most raw, we need to know some things about ourselves. And one of those things we need to know are our attributes. In other words, what attributes do we have a lot of or predominance of, and what attributes might not we have a lot of? Because if I know I'm high on perseverance, for example, but low on adaptability, that's going to affect my performance in any environment. So regardless, and so I would say any in certain environment is going to be it's going to differentiate which attributes are more appropriate in that environment. But understanding where and how we show up in that environment, our own unique attribute picture is one of the first keys to understanding how we're going to behave.
Interesting. So to some degree, our identity is involved then.
Our identity is the next one. So in other words, we as human beings collect identities throughout our lives. And they could be small, they could be big. It's I went to this high school, or I'm a lacrosse player, or I'm a Navy SEAL, or I'm a husband or a father, or I'm a Metallica fan. But any identity that we create or take on comes with specific and certain rules and conditions that define our behavior in that identity, or for that identity. And what we have to understand is in deep uncertainty and challenge and stress, what's happening is we're going to prioritize and or we're going to behave towards those identities that we prioritize. So the example would be Navy SEAL, a very powerful identity. When I was overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, Navy SEAL was my predominant identity. So in the worst situations, my identity was, how do I act? I'm going to act like a Navy SEAL. My next most, or actually it was probably equally as powerful, was is husband and father. It still is. And there were times, and certainly with some of my teammates, there were times even in that environment where Navy SEALs prioritized, there might be something that happens that suddenly the husband and father identity comes to play. And so this is very important for us to understand, because when we are in deep uncertainty, challenge, and stress, we may be at a position or at a point where we're acting without a lot of thought. And if we're not thinking through it, then we may be prioritizing some identities that aren't going to help us in that situation. The sports fan who beats the crap out of the opposing team sports fan. This is an example of an identity taking priority and predominance on behavior that you may not want to be doing or find necessarily pleasing. So we just have to understand what we're bringing into a situation, understand which identities we have, and what are we prioritizing.
So as part of that identity, obviously we have certain objectives, right? Like as a father, you want to be a good father, you want to be Navy SEAL, you want to be a good SEAL. How does what we're focused on individually drive our response to uncertainty?
Yeah, those objectives we have are very important, because objectives are, in many cases, our purpose made concrete. So in other words, what we do is we say, okay, if I wanted to be, as a young man, I was a patriot. I wanted to serve my country. I want to help people and be a great soldier, right? That's a really large kind of ethereal purpose. The objective I chose within that was become a Navy SEAL. And so these objectives, whatever they are what we're carrying into this a situation of uncertainty, challenge, stress. The only caveat to those objectives is A, to understand what they are, because we know we need to know that. But then B, oftentimes we have to let them go. In other words, I kind of say in the book, keep your eyes off the prize. And this speaks back to this idea of shifting and moving horizons. That objective may be too big, maybe too far down the road. So while it needs to remain in our cognizance, we oftentimes have to let it go in favor of these shorter term horizons that we're picking. But it certainly is going to drive our behavior, our whatever that objective is. My objective of becoming a Navy SEAL was driving my behavior in those moments.
Yeah, that makes total sense because, anything that is very far out and very large is going to be overwhelming. Right. If it's, I don't care whether it's, becoming a SEAL or getting a PhD or, finishing your first Ironman race, it's overwhelming from the beginning. So you do have to kind of, divide it up and pick something and go like, right now I'm going to run to the next lamppost and that's all I'm
And
going to do.
the objectives, whatever the objectives are, should be kind of specific, measurable, realistic, attainable, and timely in certain ways. So the example I give in the book is a guy I met who was he was a ultra runner, run 50, 100-mile races. And I remember him saying, I said, "How'd you get into ultra running?" He said, "Well, I used to be 400 pounds." I said, "Interesting." I said, "Tell me more." He said, "Well, I was 400 pounds and I decided I had had enough and I needed to get in shape. So I said, you know what? I'm going to just start running. That's my, that's gonna be my goal. I'm gonna run a race. Okay. And so what he did in that moment was he took his purpose or his passion or whatever that is, that the larger one, and said of getting healthy and losing weight, turned it into an objective, run a race, run a marathon. And then he began to shift his horizons, right? Because then he said, okay, well, first day I ordered I'm going to order running shoes. And when those running shoes came up, next day I'm going to put them on and walk to the front door. Okay, next day I'm going to put them on and walk to the mailbox. Next time I'm going to put them on and walk to the end of the street. And slowly began to create horizons with that objective in mind, or at the periphery. And so eventually, after 8, 9 months, he was running his, or 12 months, I can't remember, but he was running his first marathon, all in context of this idea of getting healthier. So these objectives should be concrete, and then inside of those objectives and understandable, and then inside of those objectives, we're shifting horizons.
That makes a lot of sense. So if I'm a leader and I'm leading a team that is in an uncertain environment, and I know that you spend a great deal of time doing this. Um, what are the things like, let's kind of walk through, Rich's lessons learned in research on being a leader in an uncertain environment. What are the kinds of things that I need to be focused on?
Yeah. So number one is what model we're using. What's the model of teamwork and leadership? And the model that high performing teams and masters of uncertainty use is something I call dynamic subordination. Dynamic subordination implies that a team understands that challenges and issues and problems can come from any angle at any moment. And when one does, the person who's closest to that problem, the most capable, immediately steps up and takes lead. And then everybody follows, right? And then the environment shifts and someone else steps up and takes lead and everybody follows. So it's a dynamic swap between leader and follower relationship, or I also call it alpha hopping, that alpha just hops to wherever it needs to be. This is exactly how all high performing teams go. And listen, I was an officer in the SEAL teams. I was on hundreds of combat missions. I was in charge of pretty much every one. Didn't mean I was always being supported. Oftentimes I was supporting other people, whether it was my snipers, my breachers, my assaulters. Sometimes the environment would shift and they'd support me. But what this tells us about high performing teaming is that our performance on a team, our position on a team, has nothing to do with rank or hierarchy. It has everything to do with what we're there to contribute to the team. And we're constantly in a position where we can step up and step back.
Kevin Seir, who's a RCMP team leader, and I think you probably have read some of Kevin's work. He talks about, the person that should make the decision is the person who has the most information or knows the most, not the person with the highest rank. And it is, the one thing that is, in 40 years of dealing with special operations unit, it is this idea of moving to the most knowledgeable or most situationally aware person. And I don't think we tend to see that intuitively in business, right? Intuitively in business, you have this idea, and it took me, I don't know, 25 or 30 years to overcome this idea. Like, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, I make the decisions, and everybody follow me. And now what I realize is I've actually completely flipped my paradigm to the point that, like, I'm the boss, I'm in charge. Tell me what I need to do.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the way we do that, then again, the way we create that model, in other words, create the framework for that model, is we have to focus on the second thing, which is trust. If we don't have trust, we are not, in fact, able to operate. And trust, what we have to understand, is more than a feeling, because a feeling is just a human emotion, right? Trust is, in fact, a belief. A belief is a human emotion that's been rationalized or justified by that human being. So, in other words, it tells us something very simple that we have to always remember, is that we cannot make anybody trust us. All we can do is behave in a way that forms a belief, that allows an individual to form a belief of trust. So, we have to focus on behaving in ways in our teams and as leaders of teams that inculcate this level of trust. And there are three factors, three elements that I talk about in the book. Those, or excuse me, four elements that I talk about in the book. The first one is competence. Okay, that's really very simple. It's do the thing right. Okay. The second one is consistency. Do the thing right over time. Now, interestingly enough, when we're in business environments, a lot of times we focus on those first two because those first two are somewhat visible and measurable. They can be, and I would concede, skills based in a lot of things. But the other two are just as, if not more important, because the next one is character. Okay, character is a big word. If I were to break it down, I'd say integrity. So you have do the thing right in competence, you have do the thing right over time in consistency, and then you have do the right thing for character. And then finally, you have compassion. Do the right thing because you care about me as a human being. And the idea is, if you can build all four of those elements of trust and kind of land in the dead center of all four of those circles, you have a very long-lasting, durable trust. Because if one of those takes a hit, you have things to fall back on. But this process involves very specific behaviors from everybody, but it has to start at the top. I've always not liked this whole lead from the front philosophy, because we all know that the very best leaders, they're not necessarily in front. They're sometimes in the back. They're inspiring, they're empowering, right? And honestly, when people say don't ever ask your guys to do something you wouldn't do, there was tons of things I would ask my guys to do that I couldn't do because I couldn't do them. I can't shoot the way my snipers can, or put breaches on a door the way my breachers can. So all this said, the one place we always have to go first as leaders is with these behaviors. We have to go further with these behaviors. We have to model the behaviors we want to see more of, and then reward the behaviors we want to see more of. And if you do that, you begin to build the framework of trust, which allows in this model.
What I like about this as a framework is we are very inclined to look at the first two heavily, especially in hiring, right? Oh, this guy's really good. And I've written articles for Entrepreneur about the making the mistake of hiring competence at the expense of character. Or hiring, a high performing asshole, as one of my favorite teams refers to it. And the character and compassion are the parts that, I think back to all the leaders that I've worked with over the years, and the ones that were really amazing. Yeah, they were ridiculously competent. I mean, you are talking really high functioning individuals, very smart, very consistent. But what sets them apart and what people talk about is not, oh, that guy was an amazing Marine. They say that guy really cared about his guys. He did the right thing all the time.
Yeah.
And,
Well,
and I
and this
think
is
that,
why, by the way, John, and this is why I started my whole writing career, I guess, with attributes, because what we're talking about, those other two, character and compassion, are largely attribute based. They're about qualities that we bring to the table. I will concede, because the model does require competence and consistency. It's competence and consistency are part of the trust model. You can't have a full-blown relationship of trust with someone if they are completely incompetent at what they're doing. It's part of that. However, like you said, we have to be careful oftentimes, because in business, the easy button are those skills that we can see versus the attributes that we can't necessarily see.
yeah, I mean, I've got to trust that you know what you're doing, that you're going to be able to do it, that you're going to do the right thing, and that you're going to care about me and the team. Okay, so if we've got the framework, we've got the model, talk to me a little bit about the engine or culture.
Yeah, the engine is the culture. And what we have to understand about culture is going to be created. It's going to form in any team, organization, or group naturally and automatically. If we as leaders aren't cognizant and quite deliberate about what that culture should be, then that when that culture forms, we might not look like what it looks like, right? So culture is gonna happen no matter what. We as leaders have to be more deliberate in forming that culture. Now, one of the ways we can do that is to go back to our ideas on identity, since identity drives behavior. And what I failed to say at the front end is that the two most powerful words in the English language, or the human language, I think, are I am. Because whatever you put after those two words shapes your behavior. It drives you towards a certain behavior, towards a certain goal. And so it's very important that we understand what we're putting after I am. And you can do this as a team as well. You can create a culture, and by generating even a short list of I am statements, what it does is it starts to define what it looks like, what the behavior looks like to be a part of that culture. I did this with the command I was in charge of, in the SEALs. We created a list of I am statements, things like I am disciplined, I am a surgical warrior, I am humble. Right? These were all behaviors that started to speak to this is what it means. These are the rules and conditions that are required to be a part of this culture. And if you do that culturally, and what we always do is we always finish that last I am statement with the name of the command itself, or the name of the team or the business, because then you're solidifying it. So I am SEAL team, whatever. It solidifies this idea that, okay, this is who I am. These are the rules I behave by, and now I know exactly what culture looks like. That's the engine that will start to begin to propel any team in whatever direction you want it to go.
I love that. Okay, so just to sum up, if I'm a leader, I'm looking to build a dynamic subordination model in my team. I'm building trust through the four C's: competence, character, consistency, compassion. And then I'm trying to build a culture rooted in the identity of the organization that is supporting all of the things that we just talked about.
100%. And I know the one other caveat I'll say is if you do that, don't as a leader try to do it by yourself. Get buy-in from if the culture already exists or if the team already exists. Get buy-in from different parts of the team so they can figure out you can figure out together. When I first did it, I actually pulled in my team leaders and my troop chiefs and said, "Hey, this is what I'm thinking about these I am statements," and that actually went very well. The mistake I actually made was I should have about 6 months down the road gone to the entire command and said, "Okay, how do we feel about this? How does this culture feel? How do we want to reshape it in terms of making sure that it speaks to this command as a culture?" If I had done that, those I am statements would still exist in that command. I think they largely went away when I went away. And so what we have to do is, if we do this project, make sure we're not doing it in a vacuum. And even a vacuum can even be just the executives. Don't think that just the executives need to do this. Get some buy-in from every level to understand what's actually going on, so you have full visibility of the team.
That's fantastic, Rich. How can people find your work?
Well, so the books are on Amazon, and so you can get them there. You can find all of what we do at theattributes.com. That's where we have everything we do. We do obviously keynote speeches. We do consulting with businesses and teams and organizations, both on attributes and mastering uncertainty. So I think theattributes.com is a great one-stop shop. And then, of course, I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn and a couple of those other platforms. I think Instagram and LinkedIn are probably the most predominant, where I try to put out content pretty deliberately and consistently. So,
Beautiful. And we'll link to all that in the show notes. Thank you so much, Rich. I appreciate you, brother.
hey, appreciate you too, John. Thanks for having me.